Hugh Hendry, welcome to Hardtalk.
Thank you.
You are a risk taker at a time when regulators are trying to de-risk financial markets. Does that make life difficult for you?
Yes, it does. And I think it, by implication, makes life difficult for everyone. And risk is used commonly, and I don't know if it's fully understood. Is risk truth? Is what I do the pursuit of truth, and therefore have we reached a point in society where the truth is perhaps unpalatable, and therefore we bring forward this notion of reining in the truth? It's a deeper
Search for
issue.
truth would be one way of putting it. Another way of putting it to some people who observe what's happened in the markets in the last 2 or 3 years would be seeing it as a form of gambling, betting.
Well, I think the objection to what's gone on has been the lack of symmetry. There is, I think most people accept there's one thing to make a lot of money, to be successful, and I think everyone supports it. It's when it goes the other way, yeah, and when it invokes the notion of a subsidy or a bailout. I think that's what rankles in the mind, and that's what's causing this debate, this much needed debate. Now, I would say what we've seen in the last 3 years, that's not capitalism. Once you've underwritten risk, I promise you my risk-taking is not underwritten by the public purse.
You're talking about the big banks and the degree to which, when they ran into huge trouble, it was governments who rushed in to bail them out and to save them.
So I guess I'm drawing a distinction between the banking community and the hedge fund community.
And I want to explore the difference between the two, but before I get there, I just want to stick with the notion of what you do and how to define it. You make not all of your money, but a lot of your money by taking a negative view, by sort of ruthlessly exposing what you see as the overvaluation of certain assets or currencies or even national economies. And that makes you enemies, doesn't it?
I'm kind of gasping for air with the adjectives ruthless. If only I were ruthless. I tell you,
Capitalism's a ruthless business.
It can be, yeah, and
it has to be. Doesn't it have to be?
It should be. You're quite right. It should be. Again, back to the symmetry. I get something right, well done me. I get something wrong, I pay for the consequences. You're quite right. I'd put it slightly different. I would say my earliest report card, if you will, when I was at school, very, very young, 5 or 6 years old, and I promise you, they said, a very nice young chap, but they said, my goodness, for someone so young, he worries. He's a great worrier. And if you will, I've grown up and I capitalized upon my propensity to worry about things. So I take risk, and then I'm full of foreboding and I'm full of fear that I've got things wrong. And that makes me a good and a conscious risk taker.
I'm sure your school report didn't describe you as a vulture or a hunting dog, but there are politicians who you've clashed with in the last year or so who've pointed to the activities you're involved in with your hedge fund and have said, this is quoting the Danish MEP, former Danish Prime Minister, Mr. Rasmussen, these guys are like vultures or hunting dogs. When a state is in trouble, you can be sure in a nanosecond that the hedge funds will be out with their attack.
Indeed. I mean, he should be a poet, clearly. I think Hollywood beckons for someone. I think he could write a very, very long and tiring narrative. I had a similar diatribe with the Central Bank of Hungary. The Central Bank of Hungary sat idly as their population took mortgages denominated in Swiss francs and in Japanese yen. And they did so because the cost of borrowing those currencies seemed very modest when compared to borrowing in Hungarian forint. But they were taking on an enormous financial risk, which was called to bear. So I would say, and he said, we're like the little antelope, and these dogs are attacking us, these lions are attacking us. But he ignores the fact that he was playing games with economic equilibrium. I would say to you, I'm a guard dog of capitalism. My role is to preserve the role of capitalism.
But you have power without accountability.
If only. Please give me some power. I have no power. And I'm not guaranteed to make money. If only I were guaranteed to make money.
But
if only it were easy to make money.
I'm not suggesting you always make money, but the way you and other hedge funds work, gives you an enormous amount of clout. And we're talking now, whether we're talking Hungary or whether we're talking the Greek financial crisis, we're talking about democratic governments who see their currencies and their economies under fire from hedge funds such as yours. They are ultimately democratically elected. They have some sort of mandate, but you and the hedge funds undermine their economic strength.
No, my riposte to that is that you grossly exaggerate the size and the significance of the hedge fund community. In terms of trading volumes, in terms of assets under management, they are fleas compared to the asinine behavior that one finds in our pension funds, in our insurance companies.
But your own business doesn't actually believe that. Antonio Borges, who's chairman of the Hedge Fund Standards Board, whom we had on this show just a few weeks ago, said to us, he said, we hedge funds are market movers because everybody in the market understands that the hedge funds have more information and therefore they have clout. It is not just about size, he said.
I don't think you can make that a genetic term. I think you could certainly, that would be applicable to someone like George Soros, who over a course of 40 or 50 years of successfully speculating, when he raises an opinion, people listen. I can assure you, however, that if I were to raise my opinion, if I'm wrong, I get run over.
Well, let's not personalize it. Maybe your hedge fund and your current profile isn't as high as George Soros's, I accept that, but let's stick with Soros,
Sure.
or let's stick with somebody like John Poulson, who runs one of the huge American hedge funds. When they place a bet, and now we're talking about a short bet, that is betting that something will decline in value, not go up, shouldn't we all know about it? Isn't there a fundamental problem that the hedge funds are not transparent and other players in the market don't know about the bets you're placing?
I agree. Transparency is a good thing. I've got no complaint with transparency. Transparency is actually quite high, and especially the transparency applicable to US hedge funds. Paulson you mentioned, and indeed Soros, they have very large positions in gold. These are known. And I might add that Paulson, year to date is losing money. So again, he's not guaranteed any money just from a previous success in another year.
So when the EU and indeed the US through the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, are seeking to introduce new rules, more transparency, more clarity about the leverage that you're undertaking, the risks you're undertaking, you're entirely happy with that?
I don't think anyone has an issue with that. It's when you come to the notion of blanket bans. That's when it's very, very interesting, and that's when there are howls of protest.
But again, if the German government, for example, wants to ban certain forms of short selling, they are entitled to do so, are they not?
Of course they are. Of course they are. But once you start, remember, what are you doing? You're banning behaviour. Someone,
what they would regard as abusive and dangerous behaviour,
again,
deleterious to their economy.
But that is a normal, that is a value judgment taken by them. And that may be inspired by the fact that it reveals either inconsistencies or mistakes that they are responsible for and they don't wish to come to light.
You, and from the very beginning of this interview, you made a point of it, you have compared what you do with the big banks. You say you take on real risk, you live and die by the trading decisions you make, whereas, as we've seen in the last couple of years, that ain't necessarily so for the biggest banks, for whom failure is not an option as far as national governments are concerned. Do you want to see the big banks stopped from engaging in the sorts of investment activities that you engage in?
Yes. Yes, I do.
And that would be quite simply because that serves you.
I think I say that more at the level of society. I also would say to you, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. What's happening today happened 50, 60 years. It happened in the bankruptcy of the American banking sector in 1932, 1933. And there was, speculation became a pejorative term. Taking debt became the least likely thing you would do. And the banking sector became invisible. There was an insistence that it no longer should achieve these very high profit margins. And society's mood and judgment came to pass.
But isn't there an irony, maybe even a contradiction here? Because you've said that you believe transparency is right, that there should be more clarity about what kind of trading is being done and where risk lies. And the truth is that because of what's happened over the last 2 years, the banks are now very heavily regulated, whether it be by the Bank of England or whether it be by the Federal Reserve in the US and their different agencies. They are under very close scrutiny, much more scrutiny than you're under.
I would come back differently. I would say the constancy has been regulation. Outside the nuclear power industry, the financial industry is the most regulated sector in the economy. Okay? I'd say, however, that the most effective form of regulation is that if you mess things up, you fail. And that's the regulation that I'm subject to. In your introduction, you suggested that I take extreme risk. I can promise you I do not take extreme risk. I take on people's hard-earned capital, families that have had wealth and they've passed that wealth from one generation to another. Do you think for one moment they would give it to me, sitting in my office in London, for me to take extreme risks with their capital?
I do think they might well, but many hedge funds, you know as well as I do, hundreds of hedge funds have gone bust in the last couple of years.
Extreme risk means that there is a very high probability of losing all of that capital.
But that's what has happened. I mean, that is the price that people pay to invest in the high-reward industry that you're in.
The world that I operate in is subject to that regulation, that they might lose everything. And so I promise you, I spent half of my time allaying their fears, being transparent, addressing all of the issues. Where could I lose money? How much money could I lose? I tell you, I'm losing money this month. It's a very uncomfortable process. My phone never stops.
I'm sure it is, but you from the beginning have insisted to me that one of the key points here is that you, your hedge fund and others like you, are not too big to fail. There is the reality, the possibility of failure.
Indeed. And that's the regulation that I...
Yeah, but my point is this. If the banks, as you want to see, are told they can no longer engage in a whole range of investment banking activities, that sort of activity will be shunted more and more to the so-called shadow banking sector, of which you are a part, making you bigger and therefore gravely exposed to the danger of systemic failure.
Well, I think, okay, so to clarify my position, I do not believe that investment banking should be under the same umbrella as an institution which takes deposits from the British High Street. I think if you're taking deposits from the British High Street, then you're a lender of that money. So you're extending credit in terms of mortgages and credit cards. You're not leveraging up many times and betting on where the Korean won might trade versus the Japanese yen.
But I come back to the point I made, which is buttressed by a recent report in the Financial Times, and I'm quoting, "The focused crackdown on banking, which we've just discussed, could just push risk out of the reach of the toughest regulation and into these fast-growing shadow areas."
The consequences, okay, so let's take your point, let's accept your point that we disintermediated and we're spreading, we're just moving the risk rather than taking the risk out of the system. I could accept that.
Well, that's hardly reassuring to our viewers around the world, is it?
The reassurance I would seek is if the bodies who are subject to risk-taking, if as a result of them making mistakes, they either lose money or they jeopardize their future, then the risk that they take will be a more calculated and a more socially endearing form of risk-taking, a more durable form of risk-taking. If, on the other hand, they have no fear of the consequences of their risk-taking, which is how you would categorize the last 5 years, then we all end up paying the consequences.
Interesting you talk there about the socially endearing forms of risk-taking, suggesting you do think about the environment in which you work. Of course, you have to. The political weather has changed a great deal in the last 2 years, hasn't it? I just wonder whether that is affecting your view of the balance between risk and reward. Because I want to talk about reward a little bit as well.
It absolutely does. A lot of my... I'd say 80%, almost 80% of my activity is engaged in the interpretation of social mood. And social mood has changed. And
how would you characterize that?
Well, in the sense that speculation is a pejorative term. Yeah, it's now loaded. You wouldn't offer that without being pressed that you're a speculator. You know, it has some kind of evil connotation.
I mean, when we see, for example, Mervyn King, who runs the Bank of England, going to the Trades Union Congress and saying, "Your members are entitled to be angry." Do you worry, again, about what that says about the shifting mood and where it leaves businesses such as your own?
Where it leaves all of us. The one problem emanating from the last decade is that the prosperity, that what seemed like prosperity, which was emerging from the banking and financial circles, of course has vanished. But we committed to spending within the economy, and that was predicated on that tax revenue always being there. So in some respects, the politicians, I see the politicians and the bankers as just sides of the same coin. Both of them lived the dream, and the politicians spent the money, and that's why the Danish PM, former PM, is so annoyed, because he actually thought it was a panacea, all of this revenue would never stop, and that you could build castles in the air, and that's come to pass.
It's interesting because it seems to me there's a fundamental distinction between politicians and money men such as yourself. Politicians constantly deal in grey areas and seek compromise that's workable. You are a pure capitalist, and even in this discussion what we've sort of been heading toward is your belief in capitalism red in tooth and claw. There's a sort of purity to the market in your view of how capitalism works, and therefore you're very different from the politician. You know, he's looking for grey areas. You frankly believe the market should be allowed to rule, come what may, don't you?
Well, again, it's the nature of how fearful you are regarding your own decisions. Yeah, so if you're a politician and you get it wrong, okay, you get booted out. Yeah, that's the worst thing that happens. Yeah, I get it wrong. Yeah, I lose everything. Yeah, so I'm kind of a little bit more focused. The other distinction I would draw is that the politicians, they love it when things are going up. And there are arcs of time, there are arcs of prosperity. We've gone through one of these very prominent arcs of prosperity where society got richer and richer. Now, the politicians like that, and they don't quibble about the financial consequences which deliver that performance. But when it turns, they then reject everything that they were implicit in previously.
Yeah, but I just wonder whether you, when you listen to the mood music, we talked about the Bank of England, but let's talk, the Conservative-led coalition government is living with a 50p top tax rate, it's increased capital gains tax, it's talking about a crackdown on tax avoiders and tax evaders, and we've got the Labour Party struggling to find a new leader, talking about really wrestling with inequality, looking for a new, more just form of capitalism. Do you accept that there can be a different, ameliorated form of capitalism?
I think we've had an experiment in this Frankenstein form of capitalism. I would give you the precedent in America of Fannie and Freddie Mac. These are essentially government entities which were listed on the stock market and which lend to the population to buy houses. Right? So regulated, has a public conscience, is publicly regulated, failed.
So you're arguing for less regulation?
I'm arguing for the regulation whereby failure doesn't require the purse of the public.
But I'm asking you something maybe a bit more nuanced, whether you can have that, but also have, to use the word used by Ed Miliband, one of the Labour contenders, a more just, less aggressive form of capitalism.
But that's just loaded with value judgment. So so again, you have, in Whitehall, you have a department for determining if something is just. Life doesn't work that way. We can't define just. What does just mean?
Well, I'll tell you what it means to a lot of people. It means looking at the rewards that come with your sort of business, and let's face it, I know tens of millions of pounds for people like you who make successful, high-risk bets, and they look at the rewards that come to a policeman or a nurse or whatever, and they say, our society is sending the wrong sort of signals about where worth lies.
Is it? Is it really? And do you get to the point where you say, actually, we've decided, we've had a commission, we've had a commission of determining what just is, and we've just decided that you get paid too much, and actually you don't get paid enough. So we're going to raise your salary and we're going to cut your salary. I mean, this is fantasy land. It doesn't work. You know, a footballer, it would seem, gets paid, if they're successful and score goals, if you will, they get paid an obscene amount of money. But if you went through, if you suffered in terms of you didn't show the commitment in education perhaps, and you didn't really achieve any grades, and you find yourself pursuing a task which 1.3 billion people in China can do. Can we do anything about that? Do we double your salary and just say, you're worth it, enjoy it? Or do we say, we're going to keep the 1.3 billion Chinese in poverty? I mean, justice is
so we should not for a moment think about intervening, should we, to reduce the bank bonuses, the hedge fund profits that we see and seem so out of kilter, particularly in what is now, for all of us, an age of austerity.
I have revulsion with regard to the use of the public purse in bailing out the banking sector. I have revulsion in how those
but with respect, it's not as simple as that, just saying, oh, well, the banks that are now owned by the public shouldn't pay these sorts of bonuses. Frankly, the whole financial system was bailed out by the public. Your job would not be the job it is today had the public purse not been used to safeguard the banking system, and you know it.
I'd have made more money. I would have made more money if the public purse had not been used.
If there'd been a complete financial meltdown.
I'd have made more money. Yeah. So I've been thwarted in my endeavours to make more money by the generosity of taxpayers who are now set to lose their jobs if they're public servants. Yeah? If you look at Latvia, let's take it outside the UK. Latvia is an economy where they have been destroyed. They've taken such economic hardship so that they can pay back Scandinavian bankers who were foolish in lending them money in the first place. I would advocate a haircut. I would say to you that the Swedish bankers who lent them money should be returned only 50 cents in the dollar.
When you were a kid growing up in Glasgow, and you weren't from a rich background at all, you said you either wanted to be a lawyer or an accountant because you knew it was one way to get out of your beginnings. Wouldn't it be better if we could create an economy where people wanted to be scientists, engineers, where the value, the reward that came with those sorts of jobs was as great in some ways as comes with being a hedge fund manager?
Absolutely. And I would say to you, I think it will come. I would say to you that the abhorrence about the remuneration of speculators and a kind of a desire, this notion of social justice, to do something about it, I don't think it's necessary. Because I think we've reached a point where they've taken all the gains and it can only go the other way. I think society now...
Hang on, you're talking in the third person, but you say even for yourself, you feel you've taken the rewards as far as they can go.
I'm saying generically. I think my rewards, I think I could eke something out, but that's a kind of contrarian sense. But I think overall that it's been too easy to make money from financial speculation, and I think that ease will disappear. I think there are far too many hedge funds. I think the number of hedge funds could fall by a factor of 80% over the next 10 years. Yeah? I think stock markets in 10 years' time, I think stock markets in 20 years' time may be no higher than they are today. I think house prices likewise. Yeah? Try making money in that environment. Try to have an appetite to be a hedge fund manager in that appetite. I think at that point in time, you're more keen on being a doctor or an engineer. So I think it's coming.
Hugh Hendry, it's a fascinating moment to end. Thank you very much for being on Hardtalk. Thank you.